This is part two of Toward Independence. The colonial powers started to see the handwriting on the wall as resistance grew in Africa and even in the case of France and other places that it ruled. Things such as the Gold Coast riots in 1948, the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya we talked about, there was upheaval in Malawi, even the French defeat in Vietnam and the Suez Canal failure on the part of Egypt being victorious there with regards to Britain, and then the rebellion in Algeria made the colonial powers decide that it was time to do something different. That's when there was a quick exit on the part of at least three of the colonial nations, Britain, France, and Belgium. They dropped colonialism quickly because actually they figured that it favored them. They were able to keep down resistance if they got ahead and moved out as those places started to see more and more organizations and more efforts forming to expel those countries. And they actually found that it would help them lower resistance, and retain power when they work with moderate and conservative leaders in those countries, and it helped give the appearance that they were granting the wishes of those more radical groups who were wanting to expel the colonial powers. As African independence came into being in the various countries, the reality of what it meant to be independent and all of the issues that face it also came to light. The geographical areas that had been established by the colonizers ignored the diverse cultures, language groups, political entities, trading areas, and all the other ways in which Africans prior to colonialism had conducted themselves, their way of life. We see that in the Things Fall Apart, what it was like prior to colonial rule. Groups were pitted against one another during colonialism. And so there was a shaky sense of national unity. The geographical areas that had been superimposed upon Africans were not the ways in which, in many cases, they understood themselves. Oftentimes, rival groups had been put together or rivalries had been created among various groups. There was a lot of confusion and things that were there that the new African leadership encountered. The expectation of a better life instantly was something also that leaders found themselves facing, that now that the colonial powers were gone, the people had an expectation that things would change. In many cases, people who have been living on land and it had been a part of their families for generations during colonial rule suddenly were taxed, were told they had to pay to live in those areas. And there was a head tax, a hut tax, everything you could think of was taxed. But now all of that was gone. But what was going to happen? How were those new African governments going to rule, and how are they going to support themselves? And in the midst of all of that, the economic and national resources of those particular countries were still tied to, and in many cases still owned by, the colonizing nations, colonizing countries. So it's a very difficult and very stark reality that many faced. I want to talk about, though, the transfer of power and feature some of the first leaders in various places. We begin with, in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister and later became president of Ghana, who was very influential in other African nations becoming independent as they saw what happened in Ghana and with Ghanaian independence and the things that flowed from there, and Nkrumah and his leadership. In Sierra Leone, Sir Milton Margai, who was the first Sierra Leonean licensed to practice medical as a doctor in 1926, eventually became the chief and prime minister in 1945 in Sierra Leone. In the French West and Equatorial territories, things were a little bit different. France had always had the idea that other groups, other countries that it colonized would be happy to be a part of what it called Greater France. That the appeal that they tried to use, we talked about assimilation before, was the idea that you are a part of our great French culture, our great French government, our great French system of being. And that was so grand and so strong and so appealing that it would cause people to accept French rule. Well, in this case, the African nationalists had thought, well, if we're going to be a part of Greater France, that means we'll be treated equally, treated as citizens in France. We are now part of that system. But they found out that that wasn't so. So suddenly, the French president, de Gaulle, demanded of the colonies a oui or non vote to whether they would maintain their links to France. Again, thinking that probably most of them or all of them would agree to remaining a part of France, the part of the Greater France, even though there wasn't equal treatment or anything else. France being a great society in their eyes, and everyone would be honored to be a part. Well, to their surprise, Guinea was the only country that did vote non or no. And when that happened, France tried to cripple them. They immediately removed everything from Guinea, all the French personnel files, file cabinets, telephones were ripped out the walls. The Guineans who had been serving in the French army were sent back home without pension, hoping that they would be outraged and start a revolution in the streets of Guinea. But Ghana, newly independent Ghana, and the Soviet Union came to the aid of Guinea and helped them to be able to survive and sustain themselves. In Algeria, which was a principal colony of white settlement, in fact, the largest area in French territory that had French citizens actually living there in Algeria, there was a bloody battle that went on for more than 8 years that outraged many other countries before France finally retreated and relented and allowed Algeria to become free and independent. In 1951 in Libya, Idris was made the king by the British of Libya. He was a part of the Ottoman aristocrats that were there, but ultimately was overthrown by Muammar Gaddafi in 1969, who became the leader of Libya. In Egypt, there were several attempts at independence between Egypt and Britain, and finally it was achieved under the leadership of General Abdul Nasser. Nasser was very influential, very charismatic, and a very much revered figure there in that region. He seized the Suez Canal and nationalized it, went to war over that. They won, and Egypt became recognized as the leader of the Arab world and even designated itself as the leader of the nation of the Arab Republic. In British East Africa, Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, who's also known by the name Walimu, which means teacher, because he was one of the two university-trained professors in Tanzania, ultimately became the president of Tanzania. He was also a part of the Union of Tanganyika, which is the other name that Tanzania is known by in Zanzibar, and very charismatic leader, sought to bring some much needed reforms, personal hero of mine. In Uganda, 1962, Milton Obote had to navigate the existence between the Buganda Royalist Party in Uganda, which had continued to be pumped up by the British, and he continued until he finally was able to bring his northern party together with the Buganda party, and ultimately a unified Uganda. He was inspired by the efforts in Tanzania, and we know that ultimately Obote would be overthrown by Idi Amin much later, the infamous Idi Amin. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, who went from the jail to the presidency, he denied he was the leader of the Mau Mau revolution there or had anything to do with that, but was convicted for it and was sent to prison in 1953. He gained his freedom in 1961, and ultimately in 1963, he became the first African president of Kenya. In South Africa, things were a bit different there. As we've seen before, the areas with substantial white settlement often posed the strongest opposition to African majority rule. This was certainly the case in South Africa, where you have 4 million whites who ruled and dominated over 20 million blacks. South Africa was not technically a colony, but it was self-governed by a white minority. It, at the time, was the most powerful country on the continent. South Africa achieved its wealth through minerals and manufacturing. The Afrikaner Party, National Party, played on the fears of losing white control, and as it came into power, it reinforced segregationist policies that were in place, and apartheid was born. That was a system that made blacks ultimately foreigners in 86% of the areas of South Africa that have been designated white. In other words, people who were Africans, black Africans, had to get passes in order to be in those areas. They couldn't live in those areas, and only if they were working in those areas were they allowed to be there, and they had to prove that they had a right to travel in those areas to go to work. And they were relegated to townships that were reserves, and later called townships, in which they lived, that were crowded in very cramped areas in undesirable parts of South Africa. Apartheid governed living spaces, sexual relations. The public places were segregated. They were restricted. Black South Africans were restricted to the lowest paying jobs there. Much of the apartheid system and its laws were modeled after the Jim Crow laws in the United States. As efforts in South Africa to resist apartheid, and even before then to resist the majority rule, many point to the birth of the African Congress in 1912. And one of the galvanizing events in the whole movement toward ending apartheid was the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, where in protesting some of the government rules that were in place, including the passes that people were being required to have to move in and about certain areas of South Africa, there was a protest there, and the government responded by killing 69 people and injuring 180. And that caused international outrage and economic sanctions by many countries, with the exception of Britain and the United States, who were also the strongest economic partners with South Africa at the time. And ultimately, Nelson Mandela and the Afrikaner president at the time of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, negotiated an end to apartheid. And after a lot of going back and forth and all of that, ultimately Nelson Mandela was elected the first black head of state in South Africa in 1994 and made history with that election. He also, along with de Klerk, won a Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to end apartheid in South Africa. Mandela went on to establish the Truth Commission that took place in South Africa in the effort to bring about reconciliation in the country, and many other things that happened there. But this is just a brief overview of Africa moving from the colonial era into the area of independence.